High school class trip chaperones. What was the craziest thing you witnessed or had to deal with? When I was in high school, two girls got into a fight on a field trip inside the US House of Representatives in DC. Capitol Police had to escort them out, but didn't make us leave. Girls, you can't fight in here. This is the war room. Not craziest, but how about dumbest? I took a group of middle and high schoolers on a week-long trip about 15 years ago. The students were responsible for bringing money for 10 meals. One 17-year-old brought $80 for the week, an appropriate amount. However, at the very first stop he spent $78 on candy and tractor-trailer trader magazines. I'm a bit of a tough love kind of fellow, so I warned him that he was going to be skipping meals this week because we weren't going to pay for him. I'm not sure he really understood what that meant until he left his bag of candy on a table that night in a common room and found it empty the next morning. Later that week, I also had to give him a talk about why hitting on the mentally handicapped 12-year-old was inappropriate. It was a difficult week for all of us. Had a terrible chaperone on our school's 8th grade trip to Washington, D.C. 15 years ago. We were at what I believed was the CIA or FBI headquarters for a tour and my entire group was let in except for me. They were at capacity. Chaperone didn't even check to make sure everyone got past the metal detectors and kept walking past the hallway. Nobody seemed to give a crap that I was an out-of-state school kid and my entire group was inside. Not even security. This was pre-cell phones being a huge thing. Ended up linking up with another group that couldn't get in, down the road, and went to the mall. When I met up with my group later on, the chaperone seemed unfazed by losing a kid. Not too crazy, but I was leading a trip of high school students to go to a movie. I did attendance and all was good. We got about 15 minutes from the school and as I walked up and down the aisle, I noticed a student I didn't recognize. I asked who he was and what he was doing there. He looked at me and said, "I'm Randall. I heard you guys were going to a movie." Bus had to turn around and go back to school to drop that ballsy jackass off. Turns out, he was suspended and was hanging around the parking lot and just decided he would come on the trip. I chaperoned a group of 4th graders on an overnight trip. Around midnight, one of the girls calls my room to tell me one of her roommates was locked in the bathroom crying. I got her out easily enough. It was just a simple preteen girl misunderstanding. But the part I'll never forget is another girl sitting on the bed the entire time just staring into space. I asked her if she was okay, and she said, "I don't get affected by this kind of thing. I don't have emotions." She was 9. Her mom was the school counselor. "I don't get affected by this kind of thing. I don't have emotions." She was 9. Her mom was the school counselor. Okay, that will probably mean therapy. Lots of therapy, with a different counselor. This is a total reversal of the way it should be. I went on a ski trip at 15 and both my parents came along. My mom taught at my school and everyone knew her. She was a normal chaperone. My dad is an oversized kid and had never chaperoned before, but they needed men and he likes to ski. My dad proceeded to prank everyone to ridiculous levels, including putting wet clothes outside so they dried frozen and coating the shower head in Vaseline so everyone had nasty greasy hair. The worst was twofold and torturous. He put icy hot on the toilet seat and little ketchup packets right under the lip. A female chaperone was the victim and got ketchup all over her pants and, I imagine, an unusual burning sensation on her thighs and butt. Pranks were explicitly outlawed at that point. Dad was sent to the corner. Dad sounds like a character Jim Carrey would get casted for. This was from my roommate during college. His marine biology class went to SeaWorld in Tampa for a few days every spring semester and most of the juniors and seniors that didn't really have scholastic ambition, the ones not taking physics, AP, chemistry, anatomy, etc., would always sign up for this class to be able to go on the trip. On one of the last nights of the trip, the class was staying at a camp that had barrack-style accommodations with a large room with bunk beds. The girls had one, and the guys had a different one, but separating them were the bathrooms that were accessible to boys and girls. They would send the boys in first and the girls in second, or vice versa. Long story short, my buddy snuck into the showers with a girl to do what teenagers do, and ended up getting caught in the shower with the girl. The teacher immediately pulls him out and calls his parents' house. No answer. So she demands to get his dad's cell phone number and promptly calls his dad. His dad answers and she immediately tells him what she caught his son doing. His dad acts like he didn't hear or understand her and asks her to repeat it. It turns out, his dad heard her very clearly, but he was also sitting around the campfire on a hunting trip with his friends. So he asked her to repeat it so he could put her on speaker and his friends could hear what his son was caught doing. It may have been his proudest moment of his son. My buddy never got in trouble for it by his parents and his dad never even told his mom. The teacher immediately pulls him out. Hot. My wife chaperoned a group of high schoolers on a trip to Europe, including a few days on a Mediterranean cruise ship. They all went aboard, found their rooms, and unpacked. My wife wandered around for a bit and 40 minutes after boarding found a bar on the upper deck. She went in and started to order a drink when she saw one of the boys at the bar. He came over while she was ordering, and the bartender turned to him and said, "The usual, sir." When I was in high school I went on a class trip to Mexico where we lost a freshman. He was missing for an entire day and nobody knew where he was. He eventually showed up completely fine, but he refused to tell anyone where he'd gone. 5 years later at a class reunion dinner he finally told the story of where he'd been that day. He was so desperate for weed that he jumped on the back of a stranger's ATV and rode 25 miles out of the city to this guy's dealer. At the dealer's house he befriended another man and 2 women and ended up spending the entire day getting blazed on a hill with them. He hooked up with one of the women he'd been smoking with and then got a ride from her back into town. When he finished telling this story, we were all speechless. The teacher who led the trip had his face in his hands for 5 minutes. Another guy got a tattoo from an incredibly sketchy tattoo parlor in Mexico City. We were not kind to our chaperones. When I was in HS, we played baseball in a tournament at Myrtle Beach. The hotel we stayed in came with a small kitchen area that included a small stove. After we finished playing one day we came back to the hotel to find out the room I was staying in and one next to it had burnt down. The guy I was rooming with and I had gotten a pizza the night before and set the empty box on top of the stove. As we left someone's bag bumped the dial for a burner and it turned that stove on. All of our rooms were next to each other so they were empty and no one noticed until the fire was rolling pretty good. My mom chaperoned one of school trips once. I asked her a question about leaving and said, "Hey mom, when are we leaving?" One of the kids that used to bully me said, "That's your mom," and in turn my mother replied that a boy had long hair and looked pretty girly. Pretty much shut him up for the rest of the trip cause everyone laughed at him, which in turn he left me alone from then on. Thanks mom. Your mom is a freaking savage. I took a group of high schoolers to FL for a fine arts competition. We went to the beach on the last day, and one of them disappeared towards the end. He showed up 30 minutes later, showered and ready to leave the beach, because he had knocked on the door of one of the beach houses and asked to use their shower. We had a very long talk after that. A talk about how he's clean as a mother and rest of you are salty and sandy. He wins. Took a trip with my ROTC group to Norfolk VAR. They walked us through a training session for submarine pilots. I guess that's the correct term. Anyway, we were allowed to ask questions and one guy asked how fast a sub can go. They replied that's classified. I was the idiot who said the speedometer goes to X. Seems like that's pretty close since their training and all. Dead silence. Nearly 3 hours of debriefings, along with going through the film in my camera. This was 1994. Later my master chief and I got to join the rest of our group. And don't ask what the speed or depth was on the gauges. After all that I did my best to forget, and succeeded. While the specific info is classified, if you look up submarines or ships on Wikipedia, there is usually an underestimate on how fast or deep they can go. Our high school band trips always had something crazy going on. Orlando saw the airline go bankrupt a week before the trip so we took buses non-stop all the way down. Chicago saw us get to a high school that had a student dress up as the KKK. There was security everywhere. This was at the same time the Rodney King riots were going on. Ottawa saw a kid run away. We found out later it was because his parents were highly religious and they wouldn't let him do anything. Vermont had one kid on a dare kiss a girl and she reacted badly. He got a verbal beatdown from his dad. I've also heard of kids being sent back home at the parents' expense. My personal favorite was two girls at Disney and they steal a couple of items. Of course security is right on them and they are sent home pronto. Who the heck steals at Disney? I was a chaperone for a high school ski trip to Canada. I was doing it before I had a job good enough to pay to go by myself. Few stories that you might enjoy since these kids have no idea how to handle alcohol or their horniness. Trip 1. One of the kids started acting really funny about 20 minutes into a 14-hour bus ride. He puked all over himself and it reeked. I told the kids they have to deal with it as I had the whole front section of the bus. Trip 2. Doing room checks for alcohol. These two teens were too drunk to hear me knocking and checking the common room. Was let in voluntarily by one of the kids. They walked out of the room butt naked after I presume having sex. Trip 3. After the first 2 trips I had figured out how to corral these kids and get them to comply. I had a really awesome group of kids too. They made all the check-ins and were good kids. The last night there, I caught them going back in the club. 18 plus endorsed card. I suggested it's late and they should just chill in the room. I found one kid with alcohol poisoning who had to be looked after. In another room, I ended up talking to these kids about stuff and life in general when the trip director walks in. This so far was the most problemless trip until now. The guy takes me outside and accuses me of getting the kids alcohol and kicks me off the trip right then and there. He told me to pack my crap and get out of his hotel room at 3 AM. So here I am with 90 pounds of ski gear, no money, and I don't speak French. We were in Quebec. I ended up befriending some awesome Canadians who work the night shift at the resort. They drove me to a bus station where I took a Greyhound back. Frick that guy. Oh wow, I can't even imagine how angry I would have been in that situation. You are probably a bigger person than me because I feel like I would have resorted to violence and I am typically a passive person. I know one, but it's probably not what you were expecting. I went on a school trip to Paris in 9th grade. On one of the days we had a bus trip that would take all night, so all the kids were sleeping during the night. I came to learn later that one of the teachers had to pull an all-nighter because he noticed the young bus driver was ready to fall asleep at the wheel, so he stayed up all night talking to him to make sure nothing bad happened. He said it was pretty close a couple of times. On the way back, we took a small bathroom break at a gas station. During the night, the teachers on the other bus, there were 2 buses, miscounted the number of students and forgot one of the kids in the gas station in a foreign country. They pretty much made the biggest mistake of their lives. BTW, the kid got a ride from a truck driver home, so that ended well somehow. It was a fun trip. The kid must have known the rules of the road free ride for a BJ. Not a class trip, but a band trip. Sort of my local music school to Hungary to a large music event called the Helican Festival in Keszthely. So every 2 years this festival is held, and a bunch of Dutch kids are invited from the town where I live, Hengelo. I usually tag along because I speak both languages and can therefore act as a translator. Anyway, a couple of years ago some of the other chaperones, teachers who led the bands and such, and I got a lot of really good beer that we put in my room in the fridge. A good 3 hours later the beer was gone, but it didn't take long to figure out a couple of the cheeky had swiped it, so I went to knock on their door and get my beer back. This was at about 2 AM, so way past their, not really enforced, bedtime. I clearly heard laughter and partying going on from their room, so I knocked on their door and moved to open it. Unfortunately, their door was locked. I started banging loudly, yelling in my most threatening voice to open this goddamn door right now. One of the kids clearly yelled, "Oh crap, it's AV Dutch," and it went super quiet. About a minute later the door was opened by a kid in his boxers and a t-shirt, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. He said, "Yeah, what's up? We're sleeping," in the most convincing "I just got up" voice he had. Of course, when I moved into the room and turned on the lights there were a dozen or so of them drinking our beer, fully clothed. I didn't get them in trouble, but I made them pay for my beer. I was not a chaperone on this trip, but I was a student on the trip. We went to Guatemala to work with Habitat for Humanity, and there was probably 60 of us on the trip, from high school incoming freshmen to graduating seniors. Now this was our last day and we were headed to the airport to go home. Our chaperones got everybody up and did a head count, and we went to the airport in vans. We get to the airport and we start wondering where our 2 youngest students were. They were the only incoming freshmen. Turns out they were still at the hotel, because when the chaperones tried to wake everyone up, they just knock on their room doors and they screwed up the head count. So here are these 2 13-year-olds in the middle of Antigua, Guatemala, with no adults and no Spanish skills. The leader of our chaperones ended up taking the trip back to Antigua to get the boys. They had to come back on a later flight. That's as crazy as it ever got for me on a trip as far as chaperones go. Not me, but I was on the trip. A group of my female friends were in their room and just doing the usual girl stuff, or so we thought. Out of the 3 girls, one of them fell asleep. The 2 other girls called 2 other boys over and they proceeded to frick. The girl that was sleeping apparently slept it through, but when I went to ask, she told me she definitely was awake and heard everything. The room right beside theirs could even hear the action. Was the high schooler in this one, but finally got a story that fits these threads. Back in high school we went on a trip to Lille in the north of France. We went on this tour with the metro where there was art at each of the metro stations. So there I was with this big backpack that high schoolers take with them everywhere in this metro station. Our group of students was waiting for one of the teachers and a few classmates because the doors of the metro closed on them and they had to wait for the next metro for a few minutes. Being tired of waiting, I take off my backpack and put it against this small wall near the metro rails themselves. The metro then arrives and our group is complete. So we go to check out the art in this station, which was downstairs. After that we went back upstairs to go to the next station, when there are some people looking suspiciously at a backpack and are on the phone. So my teachers ask what is going and they ask whose backpack that is. Turns out I left my backpack there. I go grab it without a care in the world, and the teachers quickly get us on the next train. In the train one of the teachers tells us that the people on the station had seen the backpack lying there in the station and thought there might be a bomb in there. So they had called the police and the bomb squad. And that is how I caused a bomb threat in France. TLDR. Caused a bomb threat in France by being lazy. I'm from the UK and when I was 19 I went back to my secondary school to supervise a skiing trip to Austria. The kids were aged between 11 and 16 and we had an entire floor of the hotel. We had to take it in turns to do corridor watch. Us supervisors would sit in the corridor and check all the kids were in their rooms by curfew and not try to swap rooms. It was all quiet until the last night. The kids had to be in their rooms by 10 PM so we started our watch then. The first movement we saw was an 11-year-old trying to sneak out of his room wearing only boxer shorts and way too much Lynx deodorant. In his hand he clutched a 20 box of condoms. After questioning where he was going he admitted he was off to see his girlfriend, who was also 12. After sending him back to his room we settled down again to hear at 3:30 AM screams coming from another room. Turned out a 14-year-old girl had OD'd on E and was having a fit in the bath. Was an interesting evening. I hear these stories and feel as though I led a sheltered life in my pre-teens. Ran across a pair of my students making out in the museum at Mount Vernon. She quickly pulled down her shirt. He extracted his hands. I pretended not to have noticed. It was awkward. 16-year-olds. And the ump calls out at second. I was the oldest student just about to graduate high school on an art trip. The art teacher had a very young son that took most of her time. Our first cheap lodging was hunting cabin that were in very bad shape. The carpet was samples of irregular shapes and colors glued down to the floor. The beds were nasty. There were rat traps. Along with us were 3 boy-hungry freshman girls, while one had gotten in some trouble and was trying to get back in her parents' good graces. The other had a lot of rumors about them. They were also very stupid. At the first motel when they saw the rat traps a boy said that if they saw a rat to just stab it with an ice icicle. Sure enough they saw a rat, and when we came to check on the noise we found them standing in the bathtub with icicles in their hands. So for the last night we switched hotels. The girls spotted some college-age guys on the way in. They managed to find them and the guys started a party. The one girl who had gotten in trouble came and got me. There was one guy drunk by himself and the other two in bed with the other girls. There was a case of beer, some wine coolers, a bottle of whiskey and a bong in the room. I informed them that I really don't care, but I'd rather not have to deal with this. There is a chaperone next door. These girls are 15 and you are breaking enough laws to put yourselves in prison for a few years. You might just want to get out now while they had a chance. As much as I love the mental image of an icicle, you might want to know that the word you want is icicle. I'm late to the party here, but I had to chaperone a large group of high school kids for an 11-day leadership session at the state university. I got off the elevator at the boys' floor one night, and several dozen boys ran out of the common room laughing when they saw me. I was compelled to investigate. It had something to do with a styrofoam cup by the sink, but as I approached I heard a commotion from the closet. When I opened it, a kid was frantically trying to pull his pants back up. I noped the frick out of there and let my intern do the questioning. As it turns out, each common room had a hot water dispenser for coffee or tea next to the faucet. The other boys on the floor begged this one kid to dip his balls into this water, 210 degrees Fahrenheit. He actually did it, and they gave him a wad of cash they had collected. Sweet deal, right? Well, we marched him down to admin, and to avoid any issues with the parents they made him call his mom and explain exactly what he had done. His horrified mother insisted that we take him to the hospital immediately and give all the money back. TLDR. Kid hard-boiled his huevos for nothing but an overnight trip to the ER just to have a couple doctors poke at his meat sack. I'm no masochist, but $20 is $20. Wasn't a chaperone, but during a high school trip to Mexico, a female student was hit by a bus at full speed and basically eviscerated in front of everyone. Everyone came back from that trip looking shell-shocked. Well, not everyone. Oh boy, do I have a story. It was from an Irish friend who went on a school trip with his year 9s once, age 13/14. I can't for the life of me remember where they had gone, but what happened on the first night was chaos. By the time the kids had unpacked, the teachers were in the staff quarters absolutely smashed, and the chaperones were planning on going into town and visiting the pubs. By the time this was coordinated, all these 13-year-olds were all dolled up and hit the town as well, and somehow ended up blind drunk. The chaperones were also on the way to being drunk when my friend received a call from an obviously drunk 13-year-old girl saying they needed help because the girl had passed out. When they got to her she was barely conscious, and it was only about 9 p.m. They dragged her back to the place they were staying and got her in the lift. It was at this point she shat herself, but no one noticed until she lost her balance and slipped, landing on her ass and thusly shooting the shite out her tiny little shorts and all over everything. They had to drag her into a shower and have her friends clean her up. She looked very unwell the next day, and it took ages to clear her shite from the carpet. TLDR. Percano. I was the student in this situation. Haven't chaperoned enough trips to get good stories yet. I was a senior and my high school band went to the UK for a week as part of a tour to our sister town in Wales. My on-off girlfriend was in the band too, now my wife, but we were currently off. The whole trip we hooked up like crazy. She'd blow me or we had sex everywhere we went, in bathrooms, hotel rooms, the ferry we took on the Irish Sea. I was seasick so she was helping me, the bus, with people around, even a castle. It was awesome. One chaperone walked in on us the first day to give my some allergy meds and saw that we were coming out of the bathroom of my hotel room, having just done it so our friends could peek in. But as we had finished up there was no evidence of anything going on. We were told girls weren't allowed in boys' rooms with the door closed, it was cracked. TLDR. Band trip to UK. Did it everywhere we could, and even some we couldn't. Added 3 countries to my list of locations. Went on a field trip one time to DC. On the way there some kid pulled and opened the side emergency door of the school bus while in motion. The chaperones freaked out but we had a teacher on the bus. She walked over and closed the door while on the highway. I peaked in 9th grade. On our trip to the state capital we were moved into the Supreme Court room. Everyone filed in filling in rows. I started a new row all the way up at the Chief Justice's chair. No one seemed to care much until I decided to put my feet up on the bench or whatever it is called and tipped over backwards in the middle of whatever the tour guide was babbling about. Also 9th grade. But in the state science fair at the university, I bought a mini basketball and skipped out to the arena down the hill. 2-on-2 in the middle of Bud Walton Arena the year after the University of Arkansas won the national championship. People talked about that for years. I was never this cool again. I broke an overhead bin once on an 8-hour flight from London, Toronto. That's my high-low light. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.